Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 50 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm back today with Curt and Jerry to talk about a really upbeat topic this time. And this is about hope. And really, in my thinking over time, whether I'm thinking about cognitive behavioral therapy or post-traumatic growth, hope seems to always find a very central place. We talk a lot, and if you've listened to any past episodes, and I'm sure you'll hear it in this episode as well, the importance of the relationship in the healing process, even in the change process. And for me, one of those things that the relationship does is help bring hope to the surface for especially folks that may not be able to find it themselves. So I think we got a great episode today, a kind of fun topic. We're recording this on a Friday, so hope is a great topic to talk about on a Friday for us. And so as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Jerry, let's start with you this week. What are you thinking about this week, my friend?
Just got back from Minnesota, and I know that they're hoping for a really exciting NFL season up there. There was a lot of purple that I ran into on my little excursion. But, in terms of hope, I want to kind of recognize the intermediate school district 287 that I got to visit, and their efforts really to change their approach to working with children that in some ways have not been successful in other schools. Their realization that to really do the same thing will end up in getting the same results. And so they've really challenged themselves to think about how to implement and integrate many of the things we talk about on this podcast into their schools, into their interpersonal relationships with each other, and into how they are trying to interact with the kids and engage them in the learning process. So I left again with hope that even though we're dealing with so many things in this country right now that may drain us from hope, there are things going on all around us that in some ways reignite that. So my kudos to those people up there in Minnesota.
Awesome. Did you get some of the accent? I love the Minnesotan accent.
I was too busy defending my accent.
Yeah. I don't think anything is going to get in the way of Jerry.
No, that is ingrained. We would miss it if it was gone.
Talk about early childhood learning.
Uh-huh.
Yes, exactly.
30 years in Colorado has not changed that at all.
Yeah. That New York City just grabs you and won't let go.
Yes.
Curt, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
I've had two really great experiences, and both of them are kind of related to one another, but how much fun it is to understand at least a little bit more about our biology and how it plays out in some of the mental health treatments that we do, and working with our biology instead of against it. Mm-hmm. How enjoyable that becomes for the therapists who are engaged in that, and of course for the client who's engaged in that as well. And I have just two groups and one group and one individual to kind of give a shout out to it. One is a clinician who just recently joined my team. I've known her for a while, and she is just doing incredible work with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we're doing a couple of really cool interventions. And one of them is all her. I mean, it's just completely her. She is doing using storytelling as a sensory modality intervention for people with intellectual and developmental disability. And it's showing these great effects of producing engagement across a wide range of intellectual abilities, all the way from mild intellectual and developmental disability to severe and profound intellectual and developmental disability. And we're seeing each person, regardless of level of disability, showing engagement just at different things, right? So at the very severe level, it may be we're getting eye contact, or we're getting smiles, or we're getting just a little bit of engagement in that level. And for others, it's working almost like a social story would, where it's giving some rules about cognitive rules about how to engage with the environment more effectively. And you're seeing that effect across all these different levels of ability, just at different kind of stages. So it's really, really cool to see. I also get to the great opportunity of consulting with a facility school here in Colorado, and in particular one classroom that I have gotten to be engaged with, and I've watched them implement things in their classroom, things that they've increased just the frequency and repetition of regulatory activities and using sensory activities in their environment. And this is a classroom that is kind of steeped in ABA as well. And we're using both of these types of interventions. We're using the motivational side of an ABA and a reinforcement-based intervention to actually get more engagement in regulatory activities. And we're seeing these great effects on the kids in this classroom, where they are showing the ability to engage relationally with both their peers and with their teachers. And they're also increasing their ability to self-regulate. And it's really fun to see and watch that happen. And this is it's fun to watch that kind of a young group of professionals get their heads kind of wrapped around this idea, and they have such great energy, which feeds my energy. And I just appreciate that so much. So it's been some really great experiences on both of those fronts.
Awesome. So my bright shining object of the week is I just finished the book, Why Isn't My Brain Working, by Dr. Karzanian, and I almost think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not, I probably am messing it up a little bit, but I've been practicing that. This was a book that, because I'm a member of Audible, they send me discounted books every once in a while. So every so often you'll get these books for like $2.99 and $3.99. And if they have the word brain in it, I basically buy it. And this one I haven't, it's been in my library for a while, and it's just like, hey, this would be a good one to throw in here. And it was a really fascinating book. He talks a lot, and it really made me think a lot about wellness and diet and exercise, and really that foundation of wellness. I think there's a new analogy that I'll throw at you guys, I'm sure, in a future episode here, that he got me thinking about, but just all the things that can go wrong with our biology and how that impacts our neurobiology as well, and how a lot of times the medical system is so, hey, we got 15 minutes to define the problem and define the solution, which a lot of times is giving somebody a pill. And we often miss so many things in this current medical model. And so it's a very complex, deep read, but a really fascinating one as well. And the one thing that, really I found fascinating that I know we've talked about is he talked about a lot of medical conditions are sort of connected with dysregulation of underfunctioning or overfunctioning of the vagus nerve. And we've kind of talked about that, how that relates to heart rate and other biological functions. And he actually put forth 3 exercises you could do to strengthen the vagal nerve, which I never heard of before. And that was to gargle, which I thought was interesting. To sing very loudly, which my wife will not allow me to do. And the third, which I don't suggest this to any of our readers, is to activate the gag reflex, which I'm not sure why you would do that on a regular basis for exercise. So it seems like if you could sing out loud or gargle, those would be the 2 best ones. But I sort of, even though we've talked about, and I'd love to get, if you guys have any thought on this, the vagus nerve quite a bit, but I never heard before of strengthening that. And I think if I'm putting all the research together about trauma's impact on vagal functioning, maybe some of these exercises is something we should think about, for folks with trauma. Any kind of, I know I'm just kind of throwing this at you from left field, but any thoughts on that? I don't know if you guys have heard anything on that.
So
those things.
one is I want to make sure that we keep this in the bright shiny object section.
Yes, I know.
Not get into the biology and lose track of what we're doing. But I think that when we think about brain development, much of what you're describing, those early functions of swallowing, of air control, of singing, of gagging, all of those get organized very early in our development, right? And so in a way, I would think that engaging in some of those activate the lower parts of the brain, which are going to somewhat organize parts of the brain that if they were not well organized. It's very much, there's a lot of debate in the field about, we know that people who have disorganized nervous systems or disorganized can benefit from, in some ways, therapeutic interventions where we strengthen things. But people who are already organized, how much do they benefit from enrichment activities? So if you're gagging all the time, I'm not sure if you already have your vagus nerve organized and functioning really well.
Yeah.
Is that really the best way to kind of strengthen that kind of, which is really kind of looking at regulation and kind of parasympathetic that we've talked about before. So, I just want to comment that, your singing out loud regulates your vagus nerve, but dysregulates and activates your wife's sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Just remember that everything is an interactional process.
Yes.
It's always more complicated.
Your shiny object is not her shiny object.
Exactly. And I'll just, to put the preference out there, he really suggests this for people that are having issues with it. And,
Right.
And so that I think mine's okay, so I don't have to do my gag reflex multiple times a day, which is good. Curt, I wonder if you I just find this fascinating that there might be these exercises that could be basically free and very beneficial that, as somebody who's read volumes about the brain, nobody said to gargle before. Any just reaction to that?
I think that there are probably lots of things that we can do that have an effect at a certain level of our biology and our physiology, but there are always multiple levels of those things, right? So there's a part of our vagus pathway that is from our cortical areas of our brain to the lower areas of the brain that gets down to the heart. But it has to pass through all of those areas. And then there are pathways like in the polyvagal theory, right, where you talk about the immobilization response that don't pass through any cortical areas, right? That those are strictly brainstem to the heart. So there are all these multiple levels. And I think that each one of these, we may study each one of those levels in isolation and then suggest some interventions based on studying each component in isolation. But as Jerry said, it becomes really difficult to then put those into an integrated view.
Yeah.
And think about intervention at one level, what effect does it have at another level, and does it have any effect at another level? So I always kind of take those things and just put a little bit of caution on them and go like, where was that studied, and how circumscribed was that study?
So I think if you could flip this around a little bit and think about, oftentimes you have individuals come into you with, say, swallowing problems or eating problems, and we tend to want to address those symptoms rather than it may be a signal that underlying biology is dysregulated, right? And so if you begin to shift your thinking to thinking about that, oftentimes people end up in lots of medical procedures when it really is a dysregulated nervous system.
Yeah.
Or an oversensitized nervous system that hasn't been well regulated based on the lack of experiences or exposure to overstimulating experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So it changes how you might intervene with that. So I think it's a nice model for us as we begin to deal with somewhat symptomatology as people come in, is how we kind of organize that from maybe a more, if you want to kind of talk about it from a trauma-informed or a developmentally sensitive perspective as opposed to a medical model perspective.
Yeah. And I think
there's a great chapter about that specific issue, right? That there's underlying biological mechanisms that drive symptoms. A great chapter about it. If it's, of course, like it's a nice read in The Boy Who's Raised as a Dog. Right? There's a chapter about a child who was really showing a lot of symptoms of failure to thrive and not benefiting even from a really, really high calorie diet, still wasn't putting on weight, when there was an underlying physiological, biological reason for that had to do with this child's early trauma history. And that's something, as you say, Jerry, like take those into account as you develop your hypotheses about what could be happening. And then you're using multiple lenses to view the symptoms through, which, as we say, is helpful.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I got from his book is, just the lack, and there's some great medical providers out there, and so they're doing amazing work, but when you have such a limited time with people, like Jerry said, is this could be a developmental thing. And how many times, if we look at a symptom-based diagnostic approach, especially in the medical thing, I think psychology and psychiatry can do the same thing at times. We will often even get people into surgery when there could have been a lot of other interventions along the way with diet, with these little activities that could be a lot cheaper and maybe more effective over time as well. So I'll bring us back to this. I've got this analogy that's building inside my brain that I'm sure will fill up the whole
nice shiny object there, Matt.
He certainly got us looking at the bright shiny.
Yeah, yes. But hey, if you're looking for an interesting read, why isn't my brain working? I'll put the link to that in The Boy That Was Raised as a Dog. Also up on the show notes as well. If you're interested.
I think there's I don't want to go by, because Curt made a really, I think, astute, is a little bit of knowledge sometimes is dangerous, right? It's like people walking around goggling to kind of do it and kind of, so I think trying to have a more comprehensive understanding of some of these issues rather than thinking, okay, if I just take this one intervention out of this kind of model and give it to somebody, that's going to really address some of the, it's a very complicated biological, psychological, and social kind of issues that might be involved in that.
Yeah. And again, the book, I just want to make sure that the book does a great job of that. In fact, he's got these workups that he does with each of his patients that give a lot of data on this. So absolutely. And usually his interventions are not great in audiobook form because it's like there's 20 possibilities to work with. And you're like, yeah, I if I was going to implement one, I'd have to buy the physical copy anyway to get it right.
So your bright shiny object out of all that was you paid $2.95 for it.
Right, and it was worth the $2.95. In fact, if you're an Audible, people will get this. And Audible, if you want to sponsor the podcast, it's a good time. We're coming to our 1-year anniversary. Yes, it's even worth the 1 credit a month that you get with Audible. I would even say it's worth that $15. So again, a segment of the population that's listening will know what we're talking about. So let's jump to hope, because I think this is an important topic and I do want to spend some time on it. And I want to start out very simply, and I really can't wait for Curt's answer to this, but I'm going to start out with Jerry first and foremost. Jerry, when I ask you the question, what is hope? What would just kind of off the top of your head, what would your answer be to that question?
My first association to hope is an ability to see that tomorrow or the rest of the day is going to be better than my current situation.
Yep.
So I have the ability to look into the future with some sense of positive expectations.
Great. And using that, I would hope that Curt's answer.
What, did you raise your eyebrows when you said that?
I hope that Curt's answer is very much more involved than that simplistic answer, which I would agree with, Jerry. That's kind of mine. But
I actually wanted to get to Kurt's answer.
Oh,
I do, because from a behavioral perspective.
Why do I feel like I'm being set up here?
Basically, what most of these podcasts really is to set you up.
Yeah, it's just a big rope-a-dope, the whole thing.
But maybe is operant conditioning.
Oh, there we go. Take a drink.
That's my
Everybody
big
take
question.
a drink.
Get your drinks ready, fans.
Well, I think, Jerry, your answer is a great answer of what the experience of hope is, right? From each of our perspective. And I think we all have pretty similar perspectives about what hope feels like, which I think is pretty interesting, that you can get here's part of my answer, right? What is likely to be a common collection of release of neurotransmitters and hormones and chemicals and electrical and like all these interactions in our body that we all can talk about a similar experience that would boil down to, if we reduced it all down to its component parts, would be aspects of our biology. And that there may be experiences that we have previously in life, in our current situation, that then lead to that same biological and physiological reaction that results in a psychological experience. And so I don't know what all of those components are, and I don't know that anybody does, but I do know that we're getting closer to finding those things out. And I think that's really hopeful. Mm-hmm. Right? There's actually some of the research that I love about heart rate variability is that there are heart rate variability signatures that are correlated with, say, the three of us describing what emotional experience I'm having, and that we may have a very similar pattern of activation with our heart rate. I think that's really cool, because then we get into some commonalities across those experiences. And that is a big step forward in our understanding of the human experience, and a big step forward in our ability to then understand what to do to change those things. If we want to generate more hope, how do we do that? I don't know anybody who's not interested in that question. Mm-hmm. I think we all want that. So being able to understand all of those components and all of those mechanisms, I think is really exciting.
Yeah.
You know, when you boil it down, it's coming down to what's our previous history and what is going on currently inside of our bodies that's generating this experience that we all kind of describe similarly, of being able to look into the future and have some positive feelings about it. And I have an experience about that. So I think that's just fascinating that happens across so many different individuals.
Yeah, and I'll feel that there's one of my favorite books, and I'm sure I mentioned it before. I'll also put this link in the show notes, is The Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Dr. Gabriel Mate. I know I'm supposed to say that in a much more cultural way than I can with my Indiana accent, but you know, he goes through it, and what I found interesting to kind of fill in some of the biology there that we see, and I find it fascinating as a displaced Hoosier that has lived in Colorado now. This will be my 18th Bronco season, and I always find it fascinating because if you know a Bronco fan, they're the most illogical people in the world this time of year, because they swear they're going to win the Super Bowl. Like, I'm not even sure as an outsider who the quarterback is or the running back or anybody, like, at this point for the Broncos, but they're going to win the Super Bowl, like, every year. Like, coming from Indiana, you know, one of our best outcomes is if the Patriots have to cheat to beat us. Like, that's like awesome. Hey, we got far in the playoffs and the Patriots deflated the balls. That's like, you know, that's kind of our best outcome. But So it's funny to watch these Bronco fans because they swear they're going to win. They get all excited. Everybody's starting to wear orange everywhere. Even for the preseason, Broncos fans get excited. And one of the things that Mate found in the research around hope is it was very similar to the placebo effect when we looked at brain scans and blood draws. And what we see with the placebo effect is that if somebody gives me a pill and says, this will make your symptoms better, this will make you feel better, what our brain does and what happens to our biology is we release dopamine and serotonin, and also some natural opiates or endorphins. And so because we are assuming that the future is going to be better than our present, and I try to maximize this when I go to the doctor. If I got the flu and I need some antibiotics, I'm taking that pill before I leave. Like, I get it from the pharmacy, I pop it open, I put the first pills in my mouth because I want to get those opiates and dopamines going no matter what, even if it takes another 6 hours for the pill to take thing. So when we think that the future is going to be better than the present, or our symptoms or our pain is going to be alleviated, we actually create this biological state that releases this dopamine, serotonin, and opiates. And just, I also have this time of year, I have my, I call it my dopamine dilemma. And it's always involves buying a ski pass. And I love to snowboard. Like, it's one of my favorite things to do in the world. Something about going down a mountain on like a glorified, expensive piece of cardboard is just one of the best experiences you can have, in my opinion. And so, but every year, and I dealt with this week, is, man, they're getting expensive. So for my wife and I, it was like $1,400 for the ski pass we wanted this year. And I'm a real cheap guy. So I'm like, oh, maybe I could put together a couple Ford passes, or do we really need it this year? But then I envision myself, and usually I'm envisioning myself in Crested Butte, which is one of my favorite mountains, going down this run called International, and I get this flood of dopamine. And I ended up this week buying that pass. And so when we release these chemicals, we're sort of, what I think is the power of hope, and I'd love, again, to get your guys' kind of thought of this, is the power of hope is that we experience a little bit, at least mentally, of what that future could be like. So my future is hopefully a great powder day in Crested Butte, riding down my favorite run. That motivates me to spend more money than I want to on the ski pass. And I think this is, hope sounds like a great thing, and we all want hope. But there's also a real motivation. I think for Broncos fans, the three of us know, a lot of people will spend all their disposable income on season tickets, like, that have been in their family since like 1918 or whatever crazy. Yeah, there, we got one of these. So this is where I see the real power of hope. It's not just a nice concept, but if we can help somebody envision a future state that makes them excited, we're all of a sudden starting to build a biological and psychological motivation to realize that state. So I'd love to get, I think Gabriel Mate does a great job of this, but love to get your guys' kind of thoughts on this. I mean, that this is a real scientific state that I think elicits real motivation towards change too.
Great story to kind of outline the power of hope. But I think it's important. There's a difference between defining hope and understanding the underlying mechanism of hope, and how to use that to kind of get to the state that you described, right? Mm-hmm. And so, in a way, you're coming from a place of safety. You're coming from a place of, in some ways, the ability to look into the future, to be able to envision, to be able to do it, and then to create some behavioral action to achieve that. Yeah. We're kind of looking at that, right? And so when we think about that state, right, that state is very different than a state in which your stress response system is activated, you're in a position or perceiving threat in your environment, and your nervous system has been sensitized, so really minor incidents create large, right? And so in that instance, it's very important for me to be paying attention to what's happening in the here and now and be hypervigilant to potential threats from the here and now, as opposed to being able to stop for a moment, put my mind, use the part of my mind that can time travel to the future, to kind of looking at that, right? And so in a way, for lots of us who live in experiences in which we feel safe, we feel secure, we feel in some ways resourced, we can begin to envision the future and then develop strategies to achieve, which is setting goals and working with a plan to achieve those goals, which is using the highest part of our brain. Lots of our clients struggle to get themselves in that state that allows them to achieve that place, right? And so if we think about, you mentioned the boy raised by a dog, you mentioned Dr. Perry, but he talks a lot about the stress continuum, in that fear changes the way we see things. And so the ability to have hope and to see the future is state dependent. That we've got to be, and in different states, there's different systems that are prioritized and activated. There's different biological, chemical reactions going on in our body that cause us in some ways to change our perceptions and our ability in some ways to engage socially in the environment and also to see the future and to make different decisions than in the past. So I think you clearly outlined what it is we're striving to get to. And the question is, how do you achieve that type of experience, creating even a temporary state for somebody, of the ability to see that coming in today, something different could be different at the end of this session, as opposed to, I can have a pass on the mountains and that kind of do it, is how is my interactions with you going to be different than what I experienced every day in the world, right? And I think that really is taking what we know about the brain, taking what we know about the nervous system. How do we interact with people to achieve that sense of hope that what I'm going to do today is going to create a different state in you and that you're going to be able to achieve something different? So every day, in a way, is a ski pass, as opposed to I'm buying one ski pass to kind of go your whole day. Yeah. So, I think that that's kind of way to think about whether it's therapy or whether it's an interaction. But if you're dealing with people who have atypical, oversensitized nervous systems, hope becomes a really important thing, but it becomes a short-term kind of intervention for them to kind of look at.
Right. And I think, Jerry, you described really, really well what you can overlay over the top of that is the arousal continuum. And what changes in our sense of time, and what is the future to somebody who's up the arousal continuum in the alarm stage. Your whole brain and biology gets focused in on right now from a very, very functional standpoint. And if you're in that state, then what is in front of you right now becomes way more important, exponentially more important than what's going to happen in 6 months. You got to survive right now. So I think, too, one of the things I think about from kind of my behavioral lens is that Matt, you described it really well, how each of the three, if we take the triune brain model, and each of the three levels of the brain can impact one another. You can use your cortex to impact your limbic system, right? So you can imagine what it's like to be going down the slope, and that creates an emotional response, right? Which then changes what's motivating in that moment. And this is, I think, where we're getting into some really exciting ground in blending a good behavioral approach with a good trauma-informed approach, in that we start to understand that as states change, the function of behavior changes. And I think that's a key point. And historically, the behavioral world has kind of gone away from looking at internal states because we couldn't measure them very well. We can measure them a lot better now. And now we're starting to see that you can do, say, a functional behavior assessment in one state, and it can completely change in another one. So what becomes a motivating variable is totally different in another state. And that is really, I think, exciting for intervention. It's really exciting to be, understanding and connecting with our clients.
Yeah. And you if you take the pure biological, I think, aspect of this is, again, trauma from that psychological perspective, especially, again, repeated trauma, stress, living in high stress, low resourced conditions, again, like Jerry said so well, your whole self becomes about, how do I survive today? How do I survive this moment? So one of the things, also as I thought about the stages of change and how to get people to kind of see tomorrow is, whereas again, my ski pass is at best, if we get a good early season, 3 or 4 months away if a basin opens nice and early. But I can look that far ahead because I know my mortgage will be paid, my car payments are okay, I got enough in the bank to cover expenses, and I can afford this pass.
We're getting all kinds of info about Matt's personal finances in there.
Yeah, I know. This has been an existential crisis. It is every year. It's an existential crisis every year to spend all this money on this freaking pass. But one of the things, and I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on this because I've talked about this a little bit in my writings and stuff, but it's to make hope in some ways concrete. If I talk to somebody about something, and I think, housing can get this, because I think getting somebody motivated to, especially that might be living on the streets or unstable housing, to get into a program has a lot of, it's, somebody cannot experience that as a positive thing. They may have been in programs in the past. They know all the work involved. They may have not been treated well. So a lot of these providers are like, okay, we can get you on a list, and 6 months from now, you could potentially get a stable living environment. Well, for most people, they can't picture that far ahead. So one of the things that I've tried to really help people, especially when they've experienced a lot of trauma and are still living in those harsh conditions, are, hey, let's at least take a tour of the housing place. So it becomes concrete, even if it's not immediate, because like Jerry's saying, I think the immediate, if they can experience something today, that may be the cause for motivation for tomorrow. But again, to make things, especially for folks with trauma, very concrete so they can have a little bit of that dopamine release, that may be very rare for them in a lot of ways. So trying to break hope down to an immediate thing as much as possible.
You're sounding pretty behavioral there, Matt.
Well, social networks rub off on you.
And that is part of the effect of the reinforcement.
Yeah.
When you take positive reinforcement and look at it as it is events that follow behavior that tend to make behavior more likely.
Yes.
And don't look at it so much as I'm going to give them points, or I'm going to give them tickets, or I'm going to give them candy, right? Those things can function as positive reinforcement, but positive reinforcement is a much bigger concept than that. Positive reinforcement can be smiles from another person. It can be eye contact from another person. It can be tons of social events. It can be following rules. It can be like engaging in behavior that's consistent with a value system. A lot of those things they give the same impact as positive reinforcement in the form of tickets, things like those. Those are arbitrary things in order to bridge delays between a behavior and its reinforcer. If there's too much delay, we get less of an impact on the behavior. So all of those things are just arbitrary things to do that, but sometimes we need to.
Yeah.
But if we can get something to happen right now, it will have an impact on what's likely to happen in the future. So I think that's a great way to think about how do we then generate more hope? Right? How do we design an environment so it generates more hope? And as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about, if Marty Seligman were listening to this, he'd be like, I did that research. Like, I did it. I did all of that on first. He kind of characterized and showed the conditions that generated learned helplessness. And then he went, I don't want to study that. I want to study what generates optimism. And so then he did a whole bunch of written books about how to generate learned optimism. And it really kind of comes down to having small successes early on generates a lot of optimism in future situations. And those are great things to think about when we think about, how do I organize a classroom?
Mm-hmm.
Or how do I organize a therapy session or a collection of therapy sessions? Those are great concepts to keep in mind for those kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I just, those small, concrete, little successes, like I said, for somebody who's experiencing that trauma, experiencing that sort of darkness and living in that and surviving that, again, they don't get a lot of times a lot of dopamine, serotonin, endorphin. I mean, they don't experience it at the level I hope most of our listeners get to experience on a regular basis. And so to give them those little positive experiences, though it might not seem that huge to us, for them, it may be I like to think about it as a ray of light in an otherwise fairly dark existence. And it just because, you put a candle in a cave and all of a sudden, it lights up the entire cave, where if you put it in a normal room, it doesn't have that big of an impact. And I think those little successes, we can't underestimate that in the work that we do.
I wanted to jump into Jerry's head for a minute and rewind a little bit. When I said functional behavior changes with states, I got a big smile from Jerry. What was that smile, and what were you thinking about that statement and about that, the implications of that?
I what I was smiling about, Curt, is as I've known you, you've integrated a lot of neurobiological concepts and understanding and into behaviorism models, and you change the way that behaviorists think about. And sometimes you go, well, I'm just really putting different labels to it. And I think you're doing more than putting different labels. You're expanding the lens in which you understand what behavior is, right? Internal and external. And I think that allows you to approach situations and individuals still maintaining the body of knowledge you came from to doing it, but with a much broader understanding of the people and individuals, both you're working with and the people around those people working with. So I think it may be that this therapist is doing all these great things with them, but part of it has a lot to do with your supervision and guidance and helping people expand their way of thinking about these traditional kind of ways of thinking about behavior. So I was enjoying your kind of talking about behaviorism through a trauma-informed lens. So it was just kind of proud of you in some way.
Thank you, Jerry.
But I want to kind of think about it. What we're talking about in some ways is what makes me have hope is not necessarily what makes my client have hope.
Right.
And that our understanding of the biological mechanisms and understanding helps me develop an intervention that is going to activate a part of their biology that is probably going to increase the likelihood of them experiencing some sense of hope. Mm-hmm. Right? As opposed to me with somebody who's in these states in which they have an oversensitized nervous system, in which they're in a state of continual hypervigilance and fear, me giving them the thought of being in an apartment and being probably is biologically incongruent with where they're at. Mm-hmm. Right? And so in a way, I may take somebody for that walk to that apartment, and for me, that's reinforcing. For them, they're not in a state to be making that useful for them. And so what they need really is some experience when they come to meet with me to feel like they're safe in this moment and recognized and kind of better regulated. So it may be that we play a game of checkers together. It may be that we take a walk together. It may be that you do a storytelling piece to kind of looking at that, right? And it's not really the story or the checkers that we're looking for. It's not this relational interaction. It's this regulatory activity that we're engaging in. Or if they're younger, we're going to get down on the play and we may parallel draw or play or do something together, because I want you to have experience in this moment feeling regulated, which in Curt's words will become a reinforcer to you come back the next time to kind of do it, right? If I'm feeling safer and regulated, the likelihood of you returning back to this is going to be greater than if I take you for a walk and take you to an apartment.
Yeah.
Right? So I think having some way to conceptualize it, whether it's behavior, whether it's psychology, whether it's biology, really what we want to do is activate a state in our clients that have them feel better in this moment than they felt prior in other interactions, and kind of looking at that.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really gives them hope that the next time they come to my office, I can recreate that experience for them.
Yeah.
Look at that, right? And so meeting people at the level that they need us to be there is in some ways generating hope.
Mm-hmm. And let me throw another piece of really cool science. And I love this part because, and if you're a regular listener to this will not shock you about the power of relationships at this point. But they also, with this placebo study, and I like, I talk in analogies and stories, so this is the best way I can describe it, is also the power of oxytocin in this biological equation that's going on. And what they found with the placebo effect, and they see this with hope as well, is that if I came up to you on a Friday or Saturday night, let's say you went out to a late dinner, I know Jerry's answer to this, you probably get a different one from Curt, but maybe you've had a glass or two of wine and I come out of a dark alley somewhere, maybe not showered for a few days, and I come up to you and said, hey man, I got this pill that's going to make you feel awesome. Just take it. You'll feel great. Now, we know Jerry would take it. But because we haven't built up any relationship or trust.
Connection is a wonderful thing, man.
Jerry would take it. We know Jerry would take the pill, right? He wouldn't even question it. He just takes the pill.
I'm still waiting. I'm like, where the hell is he gone with this one?
I know that.
Come around. Trust me.
Go ahead.
Tell
me more.
So you take that pill and yeah, Jerry would have some positive effects, but most people would be like more worried about there's that lack of trust there. Now, if you come into a medical office and a nurse calls you back, takes the vitals, and then you come in and then me, the same person, comes in, I've showered, I have a nice fancy white coat on that says Dr. Bennett. I ask you a bunch of medical questions. I listen to you, so we build that rapport and you trust me as a medical provider. What we see is when trust is in the biological equation, it releases that chemical oxytocin, which is that trust bonding hormone. And what oxytocin does in the placebo effect, and also when we talk about hope, is it makes the receptors for dopamine and endorphins more sensitive. So if I'm thinking about a future state, even if that's just maybe tomorrow, like Jerry said, I think that's very important for who we're working with, and I'm with somebody I trust. So maybe that's a resource we want someone to consider. Maybe it's doing their homework that night to get that positive feedback the next day. But there's a real biological, scientific power to first establishing that trust and safety, then the future conversations about hope and resources biologically and as a result psychologically are much more powerful. So from a nerd perspective, I just love to see this. We know the power of relationship. We've seen it since the beginning of psychology and really since humanity has started. But boy, we're starting to get to the level of neurobiology where we can really see this play out. So, as Jerry said, I thought it was really great and obviously age appropriate for who you're working with, but playing a game of checkers might not feel like therapeutic services or like you're meeting all the educational standards that you have to meet that day. But that could be the most important thing you do that generates better outcomes going forward. And I think that's just a powerful reminder is, hey, building that relationship is a scientific thing that we're doing as much as something that we kind of know intuitively also works. So I love when the data backs and the science backs it up as well. And Curt, let me throw it out to you because I've been, and as Jerry was talking, you're always a voice in my head because I always wonder, like, what would Curt think about this? And I'm kind of, I know I'm weird. Absolutely. Our listeners know that too. But I don't know if I've asked this question in this way yet to you, because as we see hope and as something as a reinforcer, those positive experiences, what about when we look at the relationship itself? How are behavioralists or you, which I'm now saying you're a behavioralist with an asterisk behind it, how do you see the relationship itself as a reinforcer? And when you go in to help an environment set up a behavioral management structure, how does that kind of come into the conversation?
I'll take you back to one of the ways that my interactions, starting with Jerry and now continuing with you, have changed the way that I think about this. So one of the things that is most important, I think, is to overlay an attachment lens onto that question, especially from a behavioral perspective, because that changes whether or not an interaction with another person is likely to be experienced as a reinforcer or a punisher, right? So your attachment lens changes that. And I think overlaying that on top of that question and your design of interventions in that sense is really important. I don't know how many times I've either interacted with people or designed programs myself earlier in my career where I made the automatic assumption that a relational interaction functioned as a reinforcer, and maybe it didn't. Yeah. And I think there's a kind of a healthy side of that, which is I wasn't approaching that question with a healthy level of empiricism. But in I think your comment about data is a really important one in that sense. So even going back to your example of puzzles, right, that can be a scientific intervention, and data around that can change how we think about that. Right, so just sitting down and playing checkers with somebody could easily, if I were supervising somebody who that's all they did with somebody, I'd be like, what's your intervention? Like, tell me what your intervention is. Like, you can't just build a relationship for forever. You got to do something. But now say we take somebody's heart rate before and after playing checkers. And now we have data showing that it is actually regulatory, that it moved a biological state from one to another. Now we think way differently about that intervention. So I think there's some healthy kind of empiricism about that question about relationships. So what is the function of relationships in this person's experience? And are they reinforcers? Are they not reinforcers? Mm-hmm. And most often, one of the biggest challenges that I see in a lot of my consultation with others is that we take our attachment lens and apply it to the experience of another person, which makes perfect sense. That's how attachment works, right? It changes the lens that we view things through in a way that is not cognitive. It's at a very, very low brain area that changes the meaning of relational interactions. And we get, as providers, frustrated when we have somebody who has a different attachment style than we do, and they don't respond in the same way to relationships that we expect with our attachment lenses. So long answer to a short question, which I think I'm kind of notorious for. But that's kind of how I think about relationships. Are they a reinforcer? Are they not a reinforcer? And if they're not, don't design an intervention where that's the assumption that a relationship will be a reinforcer. And you can get a lot of mileage out of then designing the intervention with what actually is a reinforcer. It might be that avoiding relational interactions might function as a reinforcer, which you can use to, motivate regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Jerry, we're hitting about the time. Any other thoughts on this topic before we sign off for the week?
Yeah, I think that if I kind of be reflective of the processes I have found to create hope. Is one of them is giving people some control and understanding of what we're actually doing, right? And so, and why I believe they're doing what they're doing, right? So if I come from a framework that I can begin to see their behavior as adaptive and responsive, and that they did an incredible job of figuring out how to survive in their environment, to kind of look at that, and that we need to kind of practice developing new capacities. In some ways, what I gave them was a myth, right? Is that I gave them something to believe in that explains why they're doing it. And they believe that something I'm going to do with them is going to change how they're feeling. So now I then get rituals that I engage with them. I play with them. Maybe we begin to, do some cognitive, whatever we're going to do in this room together, or I'm going to get you an apartment, and those are rituals that they then think that this myth I gave them is going to help them to kind of, that belief in that myth and those rituals create both changes, but also changes their biological state. So there's a placebo effect to that, right? And so we're always giving people cognitive frameworks and in interactions to kind of do it. And that may look very different in Aboriginal Australian culture. Process may be very similar. There's a myth and there's rituals. If you go to an American Indian population, they have different myths and different rituals. But our biology is, in some ways, is when we trust these other people or empower them with some type of capabilities, and they give us a myth. Your brain changes based on pattern repetitive, and you've adapted, and there's attachments or there's reinforcements. All of those are great myths that we use to make meaning and understanding of it. And what we know is over time, the myths may change. But what doesn't change is when I go to somebody who I see has power and that I trust and engage in a relationship with them, and they engage in certain behaviors that has the ability to change my states, and those states activate, in some ways, internal mechanisms that allow my own biology to begin to move to more complex, higher levels of functioning that allow my body to kind of do better than it did before. So that as we talk on these shows, I think there's both the content that we talk about, but the process really is somebody's coming to us in some ways different than me meeting somebody on the street, with some expectation that I have something to give them that's going to make their life better. I then present them some type of explanation of that, and then we engage in certain behaviors, and hopefully, based on feedback and doing it, they actually do get better. And then we go back and write some theories about why that happened. So I think about all these theories are really very relevant and important, and that we can go ahead and measure them and adjust them. But really what happens in the room, in between people, really has a lot to do with how our species has survived for hundreds of thousands of years, is that we come with the capacity to make connections. And when somebody shows up who is attentive and attuned and responsive to us, we engage in some type of co-regulatory activity that changes our biology and allows us to kind of experience the world differently. So we can make it really complicated, or we can kind of bring it down to some simplistic level that relationship you talked about only works when I actually see the person that's in front of me and I have some way to organize that experience, and then to respond in a way that helps them change their biological state, which then leads to different feelings, that then leads to different behaviors. And then based on the consequences of behavior in the environment will determine what the state gets, right? The probability that that state gets increased. So I think hope is a really important component of that. And it starts with the hope of the provider, that what I can do, I have hope that I can help this individual change in some ways. And when I bring hope to that relationship, I'm better able to create that state in my clients.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, you just got a semester's worth of knowledge there in Jerry's synopsis. So, wow. You can unpack that and play that back for the next year and maybe not get everything out of there. But brilliant way to end. And I kind of go back to that initial concept, I think in Psychology 101 in my undergrad counseling class, is that sense of unconditional positive regard, that whether we call it hope or whether we call it a positive approach or positive psychology, it's that we've got to in some ways hold that hope, even if somebody can't necessarily see it right away, that we believe that person can make a change, can heal, can live a better life. And I always like that a lot of that just starts with us. And so I think Jerry gave a great way to look at that and keep us framed as well. So a great episode. Go Broncos. You're going to win the Super Bowl this year, so give us a 5-star review. I said it. And join us next week as well. We've got a special guest. Dr. Olga Vera is going to join us to talk about one of my favorite subjects, trauma and spirituality. So I can't wait to hear what Curt has to say about this topic.
I'm going to be real quiet in that one.
And so please join us. As always, you can find it. We'll put the book links, 3 great books on our website at traumainformedlens.org. You can also find discussion questions, show notes. And if you want to see the video, you can see us there as well. So I want to thank everybody. Again, as people I know listen to this a lot of times, we're the one holding that hope for folks. And we just want to thank you and know that we appreciate you and all the work that you do for our community and communities around the world. So keep up the good work, and we'll see you next week for a great episode.